What does Torino mean? Torino is like the water of its rivers. An evolving city, constantly moving. Torino means a community of people, using the city as a living lab. Torino means ideas, feeding companies and creating startups, traveling fast along streets, data and connections, in a virtuous circle of minds, research and innovation. Torino means innovative spaces, a city growing stronger, discovering new uses and generating shared facilities. Torino means culture, surprising heritage and captivating flavors, seducing thousands of people every day. Torino, a city with endless possibilities.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are. We have a global attendance today. So for some of you, it's very early in the morning. For some others, it's very late at night. Here you see we have sunlight. Now, before we start, I would like to introduce the executive committee group that is here together with me in Torino, Italy. So here on my left, Alice Di Donna from the University of Grenoble.
Hello, everybody.
And Alessandra Insana from the Politecnico di Torino.
Hello, dear colleagues, dear friends. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all.
Matteo Baralis, again from Politecnico di Torino.
Hello.
And to close, Donatella Sterpi from Politecnico di Milano, in Italy again.
Hello, nice to meet you.
So, we are aware that it has been quite a challenging period, and particularly for conference organizers. And you know that we have postponed this event already twice. This conference was originally planned in July 2020 here in the city of Torino. However, the outbreak of the coronavirus brought us to postpone the event to today. But again, we were not able to have the event here because most of us are not allowed to travel yet. And so we postpone it again to 2022. So take a note. We will have the conference in Torino between the 30th of August and the 2nd of September 2022. Okay, so at the end of September, at the end of August, at the beginning of September 2022. Now we are happy to tell you that situations here in Italy are getting better. We expect that most of the population is going to be vaccinated by the end of the year, hopefully. And already now some of the restrictions have been removed. For example, today we are here, 5 of us in the same room. It was not possible since a month ago. But we're not back to our original life yet. We know that. And we also know that the situation may be and is very different around the world. I have in mind some images from India, for example, that I saw on the news yesterday. So some countries are still experiencing very difficult situation these days. And what we don't know is what is going to be next year. So hopefully next year we will be able to travel and to move again. And so we would like to welcome you here in Torino in 2022 for a regular conference. I don't know if it's going to be fully regular. For sure, maybe we will still have some restriction, but at least we will be able to travel and to meet again. So as you know, this very unusual situation that we had to face, we decided to publish the proceedings, and we've published them. You can see them here. We now have 2 volumes of these proceedings, more or less 200, well, not more or less, exactly 229 papers were published, a little bit more than 2,000 pages, and 42 countries are represented in the volume. But time was flowing, and so we decided that we had to do something, and that's why we came to the decision of organizing this warming up event. It's going to be, let's say, less than 3 hours event, and this, in our ideas, will take us towards the next conference, towards the conference. But hopefully we can do it even in this situation. So today we will have 3 very distinguished speakers, and I would like to thank all 3 of them for their availability to participate at this event. Now, as you know, online meetings require some rules, some regulations, and we have to say that now, after a year of pandemic, we are all very familiar with these systems. However, I would like to invite you to read the instructions that we sent by email. You may also find it on the portal. More than all, feel free to ask queries to our speakers. You should try to do it with the question and answer chat. There is a question and answer chat. You will find it here on your Zoom, and you can do that directly there. Another thing I would like to say is that we will have a coffee break. At a certain point of these 3 hours, we have a break with a coffee break, and we invite you to join us at the coffee break. We will. You will be, if you try to go there, you'll see you will be in the central square, Piazza San Carlo. It's a central square here in Torino, and you will be able to move a little bit around and to meet with other participants. So I invite you to go there. There will not be the opportunity to take an espresso coffee this time, but this will happen next year when we will be happy to welcome you here. So now, before we open the event, I would like to leave the floor to our president, Professor John Carter, the president of Iacmag, for his welcome speech. So I ask the director here to give the floor to John Carter.
Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are at this time on our planet Earth. On behalf of the International Association for Computer Methods and Advances in Geomechanics, I would like to warmly welcome all delegates tuned into this initial session of the 16th Iacmag conference, coming to us from various parts of the world, but hosted by our loyal and hard-working colleagues in Torino in Italy. It is a great shame that we cannot all be in Torino in person at this time, enjoying each other's company and attending the technical sessions at the same venue. I'm sure we all appreciate the reason that is not possible at this time. May I begin this very short address by thanking Professor Marco Barla and his team most sincerely for their outstanding job in organising this, the 16th conference in the Iacmag series, under what can only be described as very challenging times and challenging conditions. Their task in bringing us together has not been an easy one, and we owe them a very large debt of thanks. I'm looking forward very much to a rewarding conference, both today in this so-called warm-up session, and later next year when we will meet in person in Torino for the bulk of the conference activities. I wish everyone an intellectually and socially stimulating time today and next year. It is 16 years since the Iacmag conference was held previously in Torino in 2005, organised then so ably by Professor Barla's late father. Many of us will remember the time very well and very fondly, just as we remember fondly our late colleague Giovanni Barla, who sadly left us in 2019. The history of Iacmag started in 1972 with the first conference on the applications of the finite element method in geotechnical engineering held in Vicksburg in Mississippi. That conference was organised by Dr. Desai at a time when the finite element was in its infancy. The International Committee for Numerical Methods in Geomechanics was established then later in July 1976 after the second International Conference on Numerical Methods in Geomechanics held in Blacksburg in Virginia. Subsequently, and in view of the vigorous international activities and interest, Iacmag was founded at the time of the sixth conference in Innsbruck in Austria in 1988. Then in 1991 at the conference sponsored by Iacmag in Cairns, Australia, it was decided to rename it as the International Conference on Computer Methods and Advances in Geomechanics. And that name prevails today. The term Iacmag Conference has been used from the time of the 8th conference in Morgantown in the United States. These Iacmag conferences are organised about every 3 or 4 years, and they are characterised by very high quality technical content. So finally, ladies and gentlemen, may I take this opportunity once again to wish everyone a very rewarding warm-up conference. Personally, I'm looking forward to viewing the selected talks very, very much. Thank you all, and goodbye.
So great. Now, before we start the first lecture, we have a few announcements, a few additional announcements for you. And I'll leave the word to Matteo Baralis and Alessandra Insana for this.
Okay, thank you, Marco, and thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for being here at this warming up event. On the behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to raise your attention to the exciting program of the conference that we will be able to attend in person in Torino next year. We are working hard to offer you a stimulating conference and an unforgettable experience. After these uncertain pandemic times, we will be able to meet again with people, colleagues, and friends from all over the world. The conference aims at gathering the most advanced, challenging, and innovative issues and ideas in the geomechanics field. With this in mind, we planned the Innovation Hub event, a unique chance to enjoy an Italian aperitivo while attending the presentation of the most promising and cutting-edge technologies and solutions in our field. The most innovative startups and companies will be able to show their best knowledge and solutions in this dedicated event and to participate to the exhibition that will be held for the entire duration of the conference. In the case you are interested to present at the Innovation Hub event, please take a look to the offers that were especially thought for startups and spin-off companies. You can find additional information on the conference website, or you can contact us directly. By inviting you once again to the Innovation Hub 2022, I would like now to leave the floor to my colleague, Dr. Alessandra Insana, that has some important and interesting information for you.
Okay, so thank you, Matteo. And I would like to thank you once more for being here today to this warming up event, waiting for the in-person Iacmag 2022 conference. So as you recall, and as Professor Barla recalled, the conference proceedings were published online by Springer last January as scheduled. And the proceedings provided an up-to-date picture of the broad research field in computational geomechanics. So I would like to thank all authors who accepted to pursue their publication with dedication and commitment despite the unusual situation, and also all the reviewers for their tireless support. Now, the scientific outcome of this first conference proceedings was outstanding, I would say, but we aim at more important goals for next year's scientific program. So let's look ahead, let's talk about the future. So in view of the postponement of the Iacmag 2022, or the Iacmag conference to 2022, we immediately started to think about the organizational activities. And among these activities, we are planning to prepare a third volume of proceedings. So as of right now, we would like to, on behalf of the organizing committee, would like to officially open a new call for abstract. So we would like to invite you to submit your abstract to present cutting edge studies and your research advances by September the 15th, 2021. So you can find all the information on the website. So we're looking forward to starting this new scientific journey with you and waiting for Iacmag 2022, of course. So now the floor goes to Professor Alice Di Donna for the introduction of the first lecture. Thank you.
So good morning again, everybody. Good afternoon, good night, depends wherever you are. I would like to join Marco and all my colleagues in welcoming you in this Iacmag warming up event. So thank you very much for being here in these particular conditions. So I have the pleasure today to introduce the first talk, which will be given by Veronique Dansereau, a former colleague of mine in Laboratoire 3SR in Grenoble. She's currently a research scientist at the Institut des Sciences de la Terre, so just across the street with respect to my laboratory, so we are still very close. And she's working, her work focuses on numerical modeling of geomaterials with complex rheology. So not only rocks or earth crust materials, but mostly sea ice and snow. So it's quite unusual, let's say, material for our community. This is so today she's going to share with us part of her work dealing with this layer covering the polar oceans, which is a complex material, always breaking and moving under the action of wind and ocean currents. And in particular, it's a material which is experienced continuously the transition between a brittle state and a fluid state. So the title of our presentation is Continuum Viscous-elastic-brittle finite element model for the fracture and drift of sea ice. So I will leave the floor to Veronique. Just one thing, as Marco already said, you have the possibility to ask questions by writing in the Q&A chat. So please feel free to write any question, and at the end of the presentation, I will try to moderate and the discussion starting from your questions. So please, Veronique, the floor is yours.
Okay, so hi everyone, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk today. Thank you very much, Alicia, for the introduction. And today, what I would like to talk about is about some big challenges and some solutions that we are exploring for modeling with a continuum approach, the deformation of a very complex material that might not be very familiar to you, but might have some similarities with materials that you know. This work I have done mostly with Jérôme Weiss and Pierre Saramito in Grenoble and the Sea Ice Modeling Group at the Nansen Center in Bergen, Norway. Okay, so first I would like to start by explaining how sea ice is complex in itself. So the first thing that stands out when we observe sea ice is that it appears to be highly heterogeneous and also self-similar in many regards. It does shows to be a broken up ice cover at lower high concentration, And that is true at all spatial resolutions from the size of an aggregate of a few ice floes, which are ice plates, as you see here, and to that size to the size of the whole Arctic basin. Okay, this animation of the sea ice deformation over winter from slide data that you see here gives you an additional sense of the heterogeneity of sea ice and the omnipresence of fracturing process in it. The red linear zones that concentrate the ice deformation represents zones of high crack density on the ice cover. And you can also have a sense that when the ice is all broken up, it also drifts because it is pushed around by the same winds and ocean currents that cause it to break. So at this point, one can wonder why we don't take a discrete approach to model this material. And the answer is very easy. It's that at the scale of the whole Arctic, it would be too expensive because we would need to take into account millions of ice plates. And also it is not really suitable because we also have ice in a very dense regime that is not granular, but dominated by fracturing processes. So that's why we're sticking to a continuum model. A lot of work has been done in recent years to try to characterize and quantify sea ice, in particular its deformation. And I would like to go over the main findings of these works. So a first quantitative indication of cell similarity in sea ice deformation is given by the shape of the distribution of deformation rates that we see here. It's very easy to calculate using a field of sea ice deformation, such as the one we see here on the right. And these distributions have been shown to be heavy-tailed. So they're dominated by extreme values that are out of the Gaussian Bayesian of attraction, and they follow a power law represented here on a log-log plot. This power law decay is the signature of a wild random process. So that's a process for which we will have low predictability skills. What is also important to take into account from this is that this kind of distribution is not well described by its first moment, so the mean. A second type of analysis that has been done has revealed the amount of localization of sea ice deformation in the time and space domains. For instance, by calculating invariance, mean total, the shear or divergence deformation over a different space scale L, like you see here, we indeed see that the amount of deformation increases with the decreasing scale of observation, meaning it's localized in space. You can do the same analysis in time by averaging the deformation over a different length of time t. And we also see that the deformation is more localized as we look at short time scales, and it scales with the time t of the observation. A very important point brought up by the scaling analysis is that the mean deformation that we calculate is not the same at each time or space scale, but it changes with the space and time scale of observation, meaning that there's no proper or unique scale at which we can define a mean sea ice deformation. And that's true over all of the space scales and time scales that we are going to be interested in when doing sea ice modeling. And finally, there's a third type of analysis that we can do because scaling analysis in itself is not complete if we look only at the mean, because as we just said, the distribution of ice deformation tells us that this variable is not enough to describe the distribution. Hence, we can repeat the scaling analysis over higher moments of the distribution, and we look at how the slope of the scaling changes with the moment q of the distribution. And doing this, we see that the change in the value of the slope follows a quadratic function with a convex structure. And this behavior indicates that large deformation events are even more localized in time and space than smaller events. So basically, we have multifractal localization in both space and time, what we call heterogeneity or intermittency. So what does these statistical properties implies for sea ice modelers? It implies great challenges because in particular, we have a material that has no characteristic length or time scale at which we can define a mean deformation. And we have a material that has more deformation happening at space and time scales that are finer than the resolution of our models. Because what we do when building continuum models really is exactly that. It's to discretize the domain and describe such field as sea ice deformation through mean variables over grid cell. And then we base our momentum and evolution equations on these mean quantities. So we can ask ourselves, what can a model for sea ice aim to represent then? Well, if we know that deformation is in reality localized at scales finer than that of the space-time resolution of the model, a model can at least reproduce the correct amount of localization of the deformation down to its finest scale available. That's the time step and the grid cell size. And if we know that we have low predictability skills, We cannot reproduce the occurrence, for instance, of a single crack at the exact place and time that it really happens. We can still aim at reproducing the statistical properties of sea ice deformation correctly. Okay. So to achieve this, a sea ice model needs to represent the basic physical processes that occur in sea ice, which are the brittle fracturing, the fact that there are large permanent deformation that occurs once the sea ice is all fractured, and also the fact that there are long-range interaction going on because short-term fracturing events transcend into deformation structure that we know are correlated over much larger space and time scales. So when designing continuum model for sea ice, we're going to incorporate all of these processes here into this term of the Navier-Stokes equation for sea ice, which represent the link between the applied stress and the resulting sea ice deformation. And I would like to say a few words about why do we care about sea ice deformation so much? Well, the thing is that feedbacks related to the cryosphere generally depend on the surface area covered by the ice and on the radiative feedbacks as shown in these figures. They have received considerable attention in the modeling community, but in the case of sea ice, which has a very fast dynamics, they also depend crucially on its deformation, both thermodynamically, dynamically, and mechanically. Therefore, simulating sea ice deformation accurately is a crucial goal for representing energy exchanges and also for predicting its extent on the short and long term. Okay, so now I will start describing you the model that we've conceived to simulate sea ice. So first, the constitutive equation. So we consider sea ice as a 2D plate. It's compressible solid. And we model it following the simple Maxwell viscoelastic model, which is represented here. What's important to take from this is that the model has essentially what we need. So that's an elastic component that can take care of long-range interaction in the material and a viscous component that can represent permanent deformations. When we apply a stress on this system, what happens is that the elastic deformation initially is instantaneous, but if you wait a certain time, the deformation of the dashpot will increase, leaving a permanent deformation to the system. The constitutive equation is this one that you see here, with the relaxation term here in the middle associated with the viscosity. And a very important point is that in the model we're constructing, this viscosity is not the bulk viscosity of sea ice. Because the bulk viscosity of ice is very, very large and we would need to wait a very long time to see it flow. Instead, we use what we call an apparent viscosity, which represents just the mean resistance of the material to flow. And it's actually a concept that we borrowed from the Earth cross modeling community. I like to write this equation in the form of the ratio of the viscosity and the elastic modulus like this, because then this term, time, lambda, is the relaxation time for the elastic stresses associated with the viscous dissipation. Okay. So with this model, we have covered two of the processes that we want to represent. So that's large and permanent deformation and long-range interactions. And now we need to take care of brittle fracturing processes. And we do that by coupling the mechanical parameters of the model here to important internal variables. So to introduce these, I will use this picture of the Arctic when you see sea ice in many states. So fractured, unfractured, dense, not dense, between Alaska and Greenland here. Okay, the first internal variable is the level of damage, which represents the density of crack present in the ice cover at the subgrid scale. As another progressive isotropic elastic damage model for rocks, it is represented here by a scalar variable d that evolves between 0 for undamaged material and 1 for completely damaged material. And the coupling with the mechanical parameters is as follows. So we say that over an undamaged ice cover, the damage is 0. The elastic modulus is that of unbroken ice, and the viscosity is very large, so that the relaxation time is also very, very large. So we don't have unphysical viscous dissipation of stresses here, and we retain basically an elasto-brittle model where the deformations are small and associated only with the fracturing. On the other hand, where the ice is all fractured, D will increase, and we will let all of the mechanical parameters decrease, so that what we're going to have is large deformation that will become readily permanent. Okay. We also have another variable that's very important, which is the ice concentration, because you can see that the ice cover can be fractured and dense, and also fractured but not dense, very loose like this, and hence then it takes a sort of a granular aspect. So without going into the details of the coupling, the dependence of the mechanical parameters on sea ice concentration is compatible in our case with the rapid decay of the apparent viscosity of granular material when they decrease from their packing fraction to the closed packed limit. So we get a constitutive equation with mechanical parameters that are both function of this level of damage and of the ice concentration. And now we also need to formulate an equation for how the damage variable evolves due to different processes. So first, the fracturing, which is due to the wind and ocean forcing. So the fracturing makes the variable d increase towards 1. And we base our criteria on in-situ stress measurements within sea ice, which show that Moore-Coulomb brittle criteria is a good one for sea ice. So it's represented here. So what happens is that we consider that over a portion of the ice where the states of stress lie between the inside this Moore-Coulomb envelope, nothing happens, the damage doesn't evolve. Whereas where states of stress lie outside of this envelope, we are going to bring them back into or in the envelope to represent the damaging. So the damage will increase. What happens is that if we have a piece of ice here that's discretized, the weakest element will fail first. So its level of damage will increase. Its mechanical strength will decrease. So at a further time step, it won't be able to sustain as much stress as it did before. So the extra stress will be redistributed to the neighbors, which will in turn become overcritical. And this is how damage will propagate over very long distances in our model. So we consider time for this process that it's lower bounded by the time for the propagation of elastic waves in the sea ice cover. And considering this, we can write the damaging term in the evolution equation as a function of this characteristic timescale TD. We also take into account healing of this material, which in the case of sea ice occurs because once you open a crack, you expose it to the atmosphere, the ocean to the atmosphere, and it's going to refreeze. So the mechanical properties are going to re-increase. And this is associated with a much longer time scale, TH, but we couple these healing processes to the damaging process in a single evolution equation for D. Okay, so this is the model in a nutshell. Basically, we have introduced a constitutive relationship, a failure criterion, and an evolution equation for the damage. And I would just like to recall the physical ingredients that we have put in there. So we have long-range elastic interaction, a dissipation mechanism for the stress with the viscous term, a threshold mechanism for the brittle failure, and a recovery mechanism with the healing. We have shown in very simple experiments with homogeneous forcing that the combination of all of these ingredients gives a very complex mechanical behavior, which emerged from the physics itself, not from the boundary or forcing conditions, and in particular that the model can localize the deformation at the nominal space and time scale. And this is described in the two papers you see below that I won't go in details into. What I will do now is more talk about when we model sea ice realistically. Now we need to include a momentum equation with here the forcing representing the wind and the ocean, and also a mass conservation equation. In the case of sea ice, it's ensured by the evolution for the ice concentration and the thickness. And it also accounts for thermodynamics processes like overall melting and ice growth. Okay, so we have a system of 8 equations and 8 variables. When solving this system of equation, another big challenge arises in the case of sea ice. Our problem is that we deal with a deformable solid that carries with him a history of deformation while undergoing permanent, potentially large deformations. Hence, the numerical treatment of this problem really lies between the solid mechanics and the fluid dynamics problem. And if we succeed in simulating the very large gradients associated with the damage in the material, we are going to need a very efficient evasion scheme to avoid diffusing these gradients. So we're going to use finite elements, and this leaves us with a choice between Lagrangian and Eulerian with their pros and cons. Lagrangian is usually used for solid, but for large deformation, you need to use dynamical remeshing and to incorporate interpolation-related diffusion. Whereas in the Eulerian case, well, most schemes are highly diffusive. For the moment, the NEB framework here is implemented in a Lagrangian model that uses dynamical remeshing to treat advection. This model already has the advantage that it can be run in the long term and can be directly compared to observations of sea ice and to verify the capability of the dynamical scheme that we have introduced to represent the dynamics of sea ice. So as I said, this model is designed for global simulation and regional forecasting of sea ice in the Arctic. It's called NEXIM, and it's developed at the Nansen Center in Norway. It includes melting and ice growth process, and also use realistic wind and ocean forcing. It's actually now used in the Arctic Ocean sea ice analysis and forecast system of the EU Copernicus Marine Service. And I will show you an animation of the sea ice in the part of Prime Strait, which is the box you see here, reproduced by the model, which shows its capacity to localize the deformation at the scale of the grid element. So here is a field of damage that you see. So you see sea ice is pushed by the winds across the channel and it breaks. And you see all the cracks forming that are about grid cell large. And once the ice is fractured, it flows more easily out of the system, okay? So that was a simple simulation. And now we have analyzed the deformation simulated by this model over the winter season and compare it to observations of sea ice deformation that you see here. So here on the left is observation, and mapped on the observation are the model simulation. And we're going to verify if the MEB framework can reproduce the main statistical properties of sea ice deformation. So we did that, and we did scaling analysis, and we showed that we can reproduce the three first moments of the distribution that we have analyzed really well. So the model is in blue and the observations are in black. And we can also reproduce very well the multifractal aspect of the heterogeneity of sea ice deformation. We also have, very importantly, the fact that we localize the deformation down to the nominal space scale of the model, which is a spatial resolution, which here was 7 kilometers. This is also true for the time. So we also have a multifractality that's really well reproduced in time. So with this, we now have a model, a tool that can allow us to reproduce accurately the observed scaling properties of deformation. And we can start to use it to analyze the effect of sea ice deformation on other things like the momentum and heat exchanges between the atmosphere, the ocean, and the ice. Now we'll just show you a video of this. So you see the heat loss to the atmosphere from the ocean. And you see that the heat fluxes are orders of magnitude larger over cracks than over intact ice, which is very important to represent the overall heat exchanges over long time scales. Okay, so that is good. But now, looking at with a broader goal, these simulations that I've shown are standalone. So it's a sea ice model only. And in a global model, modeling context, we need to couple this sea ice model to an atmosphere and an ocean component. And these are in the community are all Eulerian. And so if we keep a Lagrangian approach, it entails interpolated the shared variables into a fixed ocean and atmosphere meshes. And it will include some interpolated related diffusion and a loss of localization. So we thought that we would take the path that's more compatible with the modeling habits in the climate community. And we decided to cast the equation of the MEB model in the Eulerian frame instead. And to deal with evacuation, we write the variational formulation using a discontinuous Galerkin methods. Doing so, what we do is to retain a finite element framework, and we trade continuous trial and test functions, represented here in 2D, for discrete polynomial approximation and the associated fluxes between the element interface, represented here as a 1D cut. These methods can be viewed as higher order upwind finite volume scheme in which the solution is approximated over each mesh element as a polynomial function instead of it being piecewise constant. These methods have experienced a significant expansion in recent years, including in the field of atmosphere and ocean modeling, because there have numerous advantages, but they have not yet been employed in sea ice models, nor to our knowledge, in a viscous-elastic model with a progressive damage mechanism in it. So this makes the implementation and testing of the DG methods within the MEB framework an interesting experiment in itself. And therefore, we had to evaluate the capacity of the DG scheme in handling the advection of the field generated by the MEB model. And we did that by comparing the analytical and numerical solution of a very simple rigid body rotation problem. You see this problem here is a two-dimensional domain representing a circular disk that is going to be rotated by prescribing a regular constant angular velocity. And here is the equation that represents the associated advection of a passive scalar field with the velocity field. Okay, so we tested 3 fields of different level of regularity. The first function is what we would have, the sine function here, if the model did not localize at the nominal scale, or if we applied some regularization to our solution, for instance, non-local damage. Whereas what we represent in the model is something in between here. So we have linear structure that are correlated, so they're more correlated than noise, but they have some noise in it because the model has a tendency to localize at the scale of the grid cell. So they lie in between solution, the field 2 and 3, okay? So these functions are represented here, and we're gonna turn our system now and see how they diffuse. So this is for P0 approximation. So this corresponds to a finite volume scheme. As we know, this scheme is highly diffusive and the results are pretty catastrophic. So if you look at our solution at a quarter of time of a turn and a complete term, we have a lot of diffusion if we use P0 approximation. But if we increase the order of the polynomial approximation a bit further, we see that we reduce by a lot the diffusion that we see. And with a P2 approximation, except for these wiggles that you see here, we have a pretty good reproduction of solution 2 and less diffusion for the noise here. So we need to retain the idea that our solution is going to be in between these two. Also we're working on reducing these non-monotonic dispersion here along local discontinuities. By using a strong stability preserving scheme, this is ongoing work that is gonna make us able to use higher degree polynomials, okay? And finally, I will just show you experiments in which we have tested the robustness of the DG methods for the MEB model. And what we do here is we represent the flow of ice through a channel. You see an example here in the Canadian Arctic archipelago. So significant amount of ice are exited through this channel every year because of the wind pushing it through the channel. And it's an interesting experiment, both numerically and mechanically, because in a manner similar to granular cohesive material that can for concave surface and exhibit self-obstruction to flow, these channels are known for the formation of what we call ice bridges, and they can block the flow of ice for weeks to months. And once it's a stable ice bridge formed, the ice downstream will detach from it and be driven out of the channel, and it's drifting freely. So without mechanical resistance, the diffusion of gradients will be expected to be maximum there. So for today, I will show you results of a simulation for an idealized channels that's represented here. It will be covered by a meter of ice, 100% concentration of ice that's completely undamaged at first, and we're going to push it across the channel by applying a wind forcing that we're going to increase first and then held constant. So you see simulations of this channel here with P0 approximation on the left and P1 discontinuous approximation on the right. And you see that in both cases, we are able to reproduce the formation of a bridge, and the ice downstream is detaching from it. But the ice downstream has some fracture in it initially, and with the P0 scheme, we are diffusing these gradients very fast and very fast. And so we can expect that for long-term simulation, we're going to have a solution that is not correct very soon. So basically, we see the same result here by looking at time snapshots in time. So we see that P1 approximation make a better job at reproducing, at keeping the gradients and the localization of the ice edge. But in the future, what we are doing is trying to go further and improve our scheme to include higher order of polynomials to see if this helps reducing the diffusion with a compromise of having high numerical cost and low diffusion. So that's it for me. So to conclude, we had one big challenge is that we have to deal with a material that represent a very complex aspect. So both small and large deformation, no characteristic length and time scale, heterogeneity and intermittency, and very low predictability scales. And to do that, we have built a continuum viscoelastic model that combines certain physical ingredients, and that has successfully gave us a model that allows reproducing the localization of the deformation, the heterogeneity and the intermittency, and the observed statistical properties of sea ice. And now these capabilities require an efficient numerical scheme for handling advection. So we are working on implementing DG methods with higher degree polynomials which is promising for predicting the fields with our level of irregularity. And this is actually ongoing work within the context of a project that's named Scale-Aware CIS project. You can visit our website if you want to have more information. And so with this, thank you very much. And I will take questions and comments if you have some.
Thank you very much, Veronique. So I would like to ask to the audience if there is any question. I don't see any question in the chat. So if you have anything or comments to ask to Veronique, please feel free to write your question in the Q&A chat so that I can read them to Veronique. So in the meanwhile, just a curiosity that I have is, I know that you have worked on the double scale approach also when you were in our laboratory. And I was wondering if you have ever tried to apply the double scale approach also to ice or these other kinds of material, and if it is a possibility for next future developments or.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. It's something that we are going to do partly in this new project that I mentioned at the end of the presentation. So we're going to look now at the CIs more on the context of its granular aspects. So when it has a low concentration, and in this case, it can be represented by a DEM model. And so we're going to run these DEM models to sort of try to express from them continuum equation or continuum parameterizations, but we're not up to the coupling of the two methods yet. And one of the big the main reason why is that, as I said, the DEM models or the finite element models, when you look, if you use them at the small scale to represent the ice flows, they lack the fracturing first, or if you want to include the fracturing, you need to remesh every flow, which is very expensive. And so for the moment, it's something that we think of doing, but more in the future. But we are gonna start working with the DEM model at least, and try to implement the fracturing in the DEM model as a first step to maybe go towards a fully coupled DEM finite element model system. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. There's still no questions. If I see correctly, yes. So, okay, thank you very much, Veronique, again. I will leave the word to Marco for the next talk.
So here we are back. Thank you, Veronique Dansereau, for this nice talk. You remember that the topic of our conference is challenges and innovations in geomechanics. So we like it to start with this out of the track kind of presentation. It's a field very different from what I'm studying, but I could recognize a few issues that have direct connections with rock mechanics or soil mechanics, and I think there are some interesting hints that I take home after listening at this lecture. Now, we move perfectly on time to next talk.